Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Holmgren, Director of Vibrant Communities Canada here at Tamarack. I'm really glad you're with us today. Joining me is Ben Hecht, President and CEO of Living Cities, a collaborative of 18 of the world's leading foundations, financial institutions that work together to fight poverty in America's cities. Under Ben's leadership, Living Cities has established a new data-driven model of social change that brings together local business, government, philanthropic, and community leaders to disrupt long obsolete systems and focus on achieving needle-moving results. The organization's 40 million loan fund has been selected as one of the world's top 50 impact investment funds for 6 consecutive years. Its network of local public sector leaders for more than 50 cities are spreading and adopting a new culture of municipal innovation and reimagining the relationship between government and cities. Ben, welcome. I'm so glad you're with us here and will be with us at the Community Change Institute in September.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
Ben, if I do the math correctly, Living Cities turned 25 this year, so congratulations. You're a young man.
Thank you. We did.
Yeah.
Barely beyond maturity.
In my experience, the genesis of any organization comes about due to a small group of people seeing a problem or an issue or an aspiration that can be addressed better together and more quickly than what is happening currently. So before we talk about Living Cities today and where you might be headed tomorrow, would you share a bit about why and how Living Cities came to be? What were some of the key drivers behind its creation?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting history. It was started by the then head of the Rockefeller Foundation, Peter Goldmark. If anybody on the webinar knows Peter, because he's been a Renaissance man in many positions around the globe. But when he was at Rockefeller, and there were 2 things that were happening in the U.S. around that time. One was a new law about 10 years old, but just getting being executed, the Community Reinvestment Act, which made financial institutions have an increased interest in getting capital to underserved places. And at the same time, there was a new federal tax credit called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. And the financial institutions wanted to get their loan dollars out to communities to meet CRA, and the foundations wanted to make sure that the low-income housing tax credit worked and landed in underserved communities. And so there was this convergence of interests. And so Peter at Philanthropy and the then head of the foundation at Prudential came together, and over the years it's turned into 18 foundations and financial institutions. Initially, it was to build an affordable housing industry in the U.S. And the idea was that they would stay together for 10 years at a minimum, because that's what they believed it would take to build an industry. But every 3 years, they would each have the opportunity to reimagine whether they wanted to stay in the collaborative. But they knew it was going to take a long time. They knew it was going to take grants and loans. They knew that it was going to take public sector, private sector, and philanthropy. But other than that, it was going to be this evolving, adaptive kind of collaborative that I think, to many people's astonishment, has gone on for 25 years.
Very cool. So there was some, the context was some changes in legislation that that business came together to talk about, or and foundations, and so here you are, like you said, 25 years later. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
You know, I've told you before when we've chatted or in emails, your website is one of the websites I go to, and I encourage people. I encourage people to go to it because there's lots of great stuff there. So congratulations on that. In the section on your website that describes your organization's work is this opening narrative, and I'm going to quote it. Living Cities works with cross-sector leaders in cities to build a new type of urban practice to dramatically improve the economic well-being of low-income people. So could you talk about this statement for a bit? I'm particularly interested in hearing more about what you mean by a new type of urban practice.
Yeah, so I think we have the privilege of looking back over 25 years and having invested billions of dollars in the US, worked with all kinds of partners. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you look back at the last 25 years, but even the last 40 years in the US, and you see that, in fact, inequality has gotten greater. Economic mobility has gotten less. And almost by any factor, whether it's income or wealth or education status, the disparities have gotten greater, especially for people of color. And so we have to be able to say, either if we keep doing the same thing to solve these problems, it's what they, the definition of insanity. You do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. And so we really have been focused on on acknowledging that our problem-solving mechanisms are broken, that we really don't know how to solve the complex problems that so many people face, including poverty, and that we need to try to figure out, well, what is the new way that people have to work together to get greater results? And so the new urban practice in our mind, and in the work we're doing and what we think of as our applied research in cities, is actually the way that different partners, public, private, philanthropic, community, have to come to the table and act differently. In fact, the only way we're going to get change is if every actor changes their behavior. And so what we do is work with coalitions of the willing around the US who want to build that new urban practice, who want to try new ways of working by agreeing on what is the large-scale result they want to see, what are the ways that we're going to measure whether you're getting towards that result, how are we aligning resources, public, private, and philanthropic, to get there, or how do we stop funding what doesn't work and fund that does? But it's really this acknowledgement that we're not going to just work harder the way that in what we've been doing, but actually have to work very differently. And it's going to require very different leadership from every institution and every sector.
Can you just to dig a little deeper on that? Because by the way, I really like that phrase, coalition of the willing. We sometimes spend all our energy on people who don't want to work with us when we should be leveraging those who do. I'm really interested in what some of the leadership challenges people would face. You know, I'm sure you've seen these comparative tables or charts. You know, that one column is the old way, one column is the new way, and we use descriptors.
Yes.
Could you give us a little insight into what that might look like in your practice?
I sure can. I sure can. In fact, for our 25th anniversary, we honored 25 what we call disruptive leaders. These were Americans across the country who have actually exhibited these kinds of characteristics. And one is that you basically have to be fearless. You have to actually be willing to speak truth to power, even if you are the power. You know, you have to actually use data and disaggregate it by income and race, especially by race in the US. You know our horrible history of that. You have to be able to essentially lead by example and hold your collaborators to the same standard that you're holding yourself. And basically, it's this idea that the changes are not technical, but they're adaptive, you know, and that we're going to go down a path, and if it's not working, we're going to have the power to change, or to pivot, or to keep going even deeper. But it's that we're not going to accept the status quo, which I think all of us, including myself, for many years thought if we just worked harder, if we just had more money, if we just, you know, our goodwill was actually going to change the world, and it doesn't. And so these are the types of leadership traits that you would think would be common, but unfortunately are not.
Okay, thank you. At Tamarack, we know that intractable problems like poverty cannot be optimally addressed without public sector involvement and innovation, which is one of the Living Cities practice areas.
Yes.
On one of our phone calls, you and I touched on how overcoming racism and discrimination is a must-do if we are going to build and sustain healthy, productive, caring cities of the future. Can you share with us what's happening in living cities around advancing racial equity? I've read a little bit about your Racial Equity Here program, but
Yeah,
this is
sure.
we face this challenge in our country, across our country. It's not the same challenge, not the exact same issues, but structural inequity exists here as well,
Yeah.
especially with Indigenous people. So really interested in hearing you speak about that.
Sure. Well, first, the focus on government, I think, is really important. It's not exclusively on government, Mark, but it is an acknowledgement that government, at least in the US, and I think it's similar in Canada, plays a disproportionate role, even if it's just as a funder, for so many things that are supposed to improve the economic well-being of low-income people and people of color, but it doesn't. And so I think for too long, philanthropy in particular overinvested in the nonprofit sector and grossly underinvested in the government, public sector. And we're saying that yes, we need high capacity nonprofits. We need them. They're an important part of the ecosystem. But we also need to invest in government to help them get better and get better results for their money. And luckily, that commitment has also been met with really an amazing new generation of public sector leaders, both elected and civil servants, who want to see that happen but don't have the tools and the networks. And so we have a whole network that we have called the Project on Municipal Innovation with the Kennedy School at Harvard, where twice a year we bring chiefs of staff to big city mayors together, where we push innovation at them and they pull us to things that matter. And over the last few years, it has been very clear that every major city in America, they will put as one or two the economic mobility of their citizens, especially low-income citizens, and two, issues around race. And so our board, after a series of these horrible killings of young black men by police in the U.S., our board said, we really want to do something that gets at the institutional and structural issues at place. And so 12 of our members came together and created Racial Equity Here, the program that you mentioned. And essentially, it's building upon work by the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, GARE, which you can find online, whose principles started this kind of work in the city of Seattle about 10 or 12 years ago. And what they have been doing, and now we're doing with them, is helping cities put a racial equity lens on all of their city's operations. Not just police, although that's important, of course, but also the way you run your recreation department, the way that you issue contracts to vendors, the way that you interact with the community, every way you hire. And so these 5 cities are working with GARE and Living Cities to first do an evaluation of all their operations, creating a plan for how they're going to begin to dismantle these institutional and structural barriers to racism, and then implement that plan. So we're just starting year 2. Year 1 was to develop the plan, and year 2 is to implement it. And we're excited about the progress that the cities are making, but more importantly, we're excited about the kind of response to this work that we are seeing, that GARE is seeing across the U.S., where I do believe, and some of it has been made more clear. The clarity of the problem has I think become more clear since the election of Donald Trump. But the issues have been there for hundreds of years. They've just maybe become much more obvious to those who are now looking.
All right. Just to maybe expand a little bit on your Donald Trump comment. Not that I want to get too political, but it's
Sure.
this populism movement across the world, really. And this seems to me, while we've had a long and deep history in the States and Canada about racism and structural inequities, that there's a rising groundswell of kind of race-centric perspectives that are dividing us. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm assuming this is front and center in some of the work you're doing with the 5 cities. if you could speak to that a little bit. My other question, which I think connects, is you're working with 5 cities. They're a variety of sizes: Grand Rapids and Philadelphia and Albuquerque and so forth.
Sure.
Were these cities chosen because they were a coalition of the willing too, or was there resistance
Yeah.
to doing this? Yeah.
So so we were really very pleased. So we took this idea to this network at the Kennedy School, and we said if we were going to do a competition, because whenever we do these kinds of special initiatives, we invite cities to apply. So they are really willing to do it, and they become this coalition of the willing. In part because, Mark, what we've learned, we almost do all our work in cohorts of multiple cities at a time, because you don't learn much by watching one. You know, you learn, it's really all about pattern recognition, and when you're looking across many, you can really see what are the barriers, but also what works. You know, and so we raised this idea with the 40 plus cities a couple of years ago, and 25 or 30 said, yeah, we think we'd apply. If you did it, we'd apply. And so we put it out. I think we had about 18 or 19 apply, and then we chose 5. But we really do believe that there is a generation of leaders in America who are willing to actually acknowledge our past, are willing to say that our past doesn't have to be our future, and that each one of us can come together and make a difference. Is it easy? No. Is it controversial? At times. Is it critical to the future of the vast majority of Americans who are soon becoming majority people of color? Of course. And so, you know, you can dig your head into the sand and hope that everything, you know, was still 1950, or you can say we want an America where everybody prospers. We want an America that acknowledges that our history of race is not one to be proud of, but that doesn't mean we can't change it. But we each have responsibility to do that, and we at Living Cities say, you know, we're in a unique position, representing these 18 very traditional and very well-established institutions, that we can say and do things that others may follow, that other organizations don't have the ability to do, and that's what we're doing.
Great, thank you. As I mentioned in the introduction, you know, there's 18 well-known, influential member institutions that serve at the core of your work. I can't name all of them here, but a few of them are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, etc. I'm interested in understanding why these institutions are at the table. I think you spoke to it a little bit before, but what, you know, often in the nonprofit sector, people can have a bias about business, just you know, being in things for the money and those kinds of things. I'm not saying that's correct, but we know we have our perspectives, right? So here you've got incredibly powerful people and organizations at your table, which I'm sure helps with your work.
Yes, it does.
But what's motivating them? It can't just be financial.
No, it's not. And I'd say at the beginning, you know, 25 years ago, it was very different. You know, it was regulatory. It was, you know, trying to make sure that new law showed the effectiveness of it. But today, it's that they've been working together for this really long time, that they trust each other, and that they actually know that these problems can only be solved collectively, and that we have to experiment. That if we knew the answers, we would have everybody to take them up, but that we need to experiment. We need to be bold. That we need to use grants and loans, which they both can bring to the table. But I'd say more and more over the last few years, it's this acknowledgement that the complexity of the problems needs the multifaceted solutions that these types of institutions can bring, and even more importantly, the leadership that these different types of institutions can bring to the issues. And so it really is, I mean, I used the coalition of the willing, but it really is, you know, they voluntarily every 3 years decide if they want to stay together, and you know, 8 times they voluntarily have decided they wanted to stay together. And you know, Mark, collaboratives are, you know, if you stick together for 3 years, it's extraordinary. 5 years is rare. 25 years, off the charts. And so by now, it's a commitment of these institutions. And you can imagine the leadership of these institutions changes and has changed multiple times over that time, but the institution stays because of the unique platform that Living Cities provides for them to work together, to experiment together, to learn together. They also end up doing bilateral and trilateral things that are outside of Living Cities because of the relationships they've been built, by sitting on our board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've spent much of my career working on poverty reduction in a variety of settings, Ben, and one thing I've learned as a practitioner, as a CEO at the times when I've led organizations, as you collaborate with others, sometimes you have this realization like, holy cow, how did I ever think that way before? Or what have
right.
why have we been doing that when we should be doing this? And I'm wondering, without divulging any secrets,
sure.
What's been your experience around the table with those folks where maybe there was a big aha for them about, holy cow, we really need to stop doing this and start doing this?
Yeah, well, I think there were two, and I mentioned one a few minutes ago, which is on the race issue, and it was really after Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, and it just so happened that there were 2 or 3 board meetings that within a week of the board meeting, a young black man had been killed at the hands of police, and it was just it was uncanny. It was the only time, but it was like almost every meeting for a while. And so the board said, I got a call right after Freddie Gray was killed from one of the board members and said, we need to set aside time at the board meeting just to talk about race. And it was one of the more extraordinary conversations that I've been involved in. Because my board, as you can see from the website, is in most cases the people who lead the institution or number 2 or 3. And they're from financial institutions and from foundations. And the conversation went on for most of an hour. And at one point, someone said, I think we should just talk about opportunity. We should just talk about shared prosperity. And then someone from a financial institution and someone from a foundation said, no, that's what got us here. We need to actually say race. We need to name it. We need to actually act on it. And we need to not be afraid of it. And that's what led to racial equity here. As you can tell, we didn't run away from naming it. We named the program that. And the idea being racial equity here in each of the 5 cities. But the other one was when they actually hired me 10 years ago, where they had basically flowed their money through, they were a grant maker and a lender, and they flowed it through to 2 nonprofit organizations, extraordinary organizations, the Local Initiative Support Corporation and Enterprise Community Partners. But what they said was, if we really want to make a difference, if we really want to use all of our assets, meaning our influence, our money, our people, then we need to be more active in this. We need to not just be a pass-through. We need to be able to mobilize ourselves for greater impact. And that was a pretty extraordinary event all itself.
That kind of bridges to another question around impact. So I know, as you know, Tamarack is sees collective impact as a fundamental framework for large-scale collaborative change, and you're a collective impact organization. So
for sure,
interested in how come? Why that framework?
Yeah.
And what, as you've developed it, how have you made it your own? Because everybody makes a framework their own. Can you speak a little bit about that? Why you're focused on collective impact?
Yeah. Well, actually, because essentially, what the phrase came up about 3 or 4 years after we were really affirmatively, intentionally trying to test these ideas of these cross-sector partnerships with ambitious goals. We were 3 or 4 years in, and then FSG printed that article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, terming it collective impact. And but basically, that to us is a core element of the new urban practice, and it really is that you need to have the right people at the table, that for many years, in the US at least, there was a real focus on everything needed to be bottom up. And I think what we found was there's limitations to that because you let the top off the hook, and that you actually have to have bottom up and top down. And that ultimately is what collective impact needs to be. It needs to be the people, all the people who are supposedly all trying to align towards the same goals. The other thing we learned, Mark, is that more is not the same as results. And so you may say, we need more affordable housing, or we need more jobs. That's different than saying we want every American or Canadian paying no more than 30% of their income for housing, or every American or Canadian, making the median income. When you set those kinds of results and you use data to hold yourself accountable, it's really hard to hide. And that collective impact, when it does that, is powerful. When it doesn't do that, it's just collaborating. And there's nothing wrong with collaborating, but that's not going to get us where we need to go. And so what we're really trying to do is find those folks who are willing to say, we get that you have to come together bottom up, top down. We get that you need to clearly articulate and publicly articulate these very ambitious goals. New Orleans is trying to have 50+% of young black men in New Orleans are unemployed or dramatically underemployed. They're trying to cut that in half in a decade, right? And it's already down 5%. They're already in the 40s from the 50s. But those are ambitious goals that scare people, because there's no obvious way you're going to solve it unless everyone at the table is committed to change their behavior as you see that what you're doing doesn't work. And so I don't know what Plan B is. As my friend Jeff Edmondson, who started Strive Together, and I know you know the Strive Together folks as well. Jeff and I wrote an article a couple of years ago, and we were like, we don't know what Plan B is, other than getting all the people in power with all the money and all the people who should be being benefited from this aligned towards what is the goal should be, and holding people accountable. I don't know what else you can do. And so we just have to be able to bring a rigor and a discipline to this kind of work. And that's what we really set out to do in the places that we partner with.
Just to talk a little bit about big goals, and of course then there's the challenge of how do you measure impact, and
Sure.
the question or challenges that we have around evaluation in terms of wanting cause and effect, wanting attribution to say we caused this, which often, as you know, you can't claim it for yourself.
No.
So we talk about how do you measure progress and contribution. Well, a lot of our members and learners who come to Tamarack are very interested in that side of things too. Like, how do you actually measure progress in a accurate but also helpful way that's not just about, say, data. It's not all about data. What do you find in your work?
So first of all, I think it's a really good point, because sometimes people create a barrier to focusing on results by saying, well, it's just all about data. Everything can't be quantified. And that doesn't mean that you can't agree on what the results are and measure yourself, but also look at qualitative things like, do people have hope? Are there actually more opportunities today than there were, even if people aren't, taking advantage of them? I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can measure qualitative, quantitative, who's engaged in the decision-making processes, another example. And so we look at a lot of different things, and really the way that we do our work in our what we think of as applied research, like New Orleans, is the places set their own goals. Right? What I've learned, this is my 4th national organization that I've run, and one of the things I've learned, Mark, is when you're telling locals what success looks like, it tends not to still be their goal when you leave. When they say what success looks like, it tends to stay their goal even when you're no longer there. And so our goal is really to help them identify what success looks like, how they would measure that. And sometimes you have to use proxies for measuring it, but you come up with your own measurements. You have to have short-term goals because no one is going to wait 10 years to see progress. But some of those short-term goals can really be things like, community engagement in decision making. They can be they could be planning goals. They could be leadership development goals. There are all array of different ways that you can show progress, but they also need to be tied to the large-scale outcomes, which is population level. That we actually want to see the needle move on the lives of low-income people. And so, we spend most of the grant money that we give to these applied research communities is so that they can be the backbone of these efforts and they can help with the data. It's not to fund programs. I mean, they can fund their own programs that don't work. We want to help them actually have the infrastructure that will allow them to determine, is it working, bringing the people together, holding the people accountable for it. And we look across an array of communities trying to do that, from our own integration initiative communities, which is about job creation and income and wealth, to the Working Cities Challenge, which is a partnership with the Boston Fed, the Federal Reserve of Boston, across a few states in New England, as well as Strive Together, which is cradle to career in 60+ cities or regions around the country. But we're watching what works, what are the barriers, and what does it really take for leaders to be able to lead these kinds of complex cross-sector partnerships towards success.
Thank you. Before we move to some Q&As, I have some questions that people are putting in the chat box, and I have some others
Sure.
that were sent to us. Over the course of my career, Ben, I worked for many years in private practice working with groups on organizational change.
Yep.
And often that was big change, right? Big change in directions.
Yep.
And so, we've been talking about the work that your organization's doing and partnerships you have, and the work that you do within kind of a professional context. But we know systems don't change unless people inside change. So it's a personal, there has to be personal change, not just professional change, especially when it comes to issues of racism. Whereas, how many times have you heard someone say, "I'm not a racist, but," how do you incorporate that personal change into the engagements that you're doing at your own tables or at other tables?
Yeah, well, I think it's threefold. It's the person, it's the institution, and then it's the field outside the institution. And so we really think of it that way, and I'll work from the inside out. We have been on our own institutional journey, helping to give staff within Living Cities the competencies to be able to be anti-racist, to be able to work to do this kind of work, to understand the history, to understand the kind of micro aggressions that are part of the work and the like. And that we started 4 or 5 years ago. We've doubled down in the last 6 to 8 months. But that is to give our own staff the competencies, and to be able, so they can go out and understand the issues, but also help people in the field. And then the other is that we really support the places that we work in around the country to go on the same journey. And so 3 or 4 years ago, just like when we kind of started our issue around racial equity and inclusion, we also made sure that it wasn't an add-on to our work, but it was the core to our work. That we weren't just doing government innovation, but we were doing the racial equity here. That it was about government addressing racism within its own operations. It wasn't just about helping New Orleans address male unemployment, but was actually helping them address the fact that it was black male unemployment, and then what were the unique obstacles or barriers to that. And so I think, and this has not been easy. It's still not easy. It's an ongoing journey. I would not declare victory. I would not declare myself or really anybody on staff as experts. But what I will say is that we are a heck of a lot better than we ever were. and that we're an organization that is comfortable talking about, acknowledging, learning, training, and helping others do it, and supporting this kind of work without using code language, but
Mm-hmm.
actually calling it what it is. And I have to tell you, it is liberating. As a white male CEO, it is liberating to be able to do this, to understand, to learn, to figure out how to build it into the organization, and then to set your staff, who I think I'm proud of the incredible diversity of my staff, but it's not about just diversity. It's about understanding how do you overcome and take away these barriers, these institutional and structural barriers that we've created around race, that you can have all the diverse staff in the world. If you're not addressing that, you're just not getting to the root cause.
Right. Well, diversity doesn't necessarily mean inclusion, does it? You can
No, it
have
doesn't.
all kinds of different colors in the room, and we'll all sit in different places.
Yep.
So, thanks for that. There's some questions that are coming in, and we have about 15 minutes left. So,
Okay, great.
one of the questions that came in prior to the webinar had to do with wondering if there's work going on with cities around your table around environmental issues that certainly often relate to poverty and the
Sure.
structural inequities caused by poverty. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we don't directly work on that within Living Cities per se. We're really focusing on how do we close the racial gaps in income and wealth. But many of our institutional partners, our member institutions, do quite explicitly. I'd say maybe the highest profile one of those is the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities, where they're supporting chief resilience officers all over the globe, maybe 30, 35 in North America. But they define resilience to include everything from environmental to economic, but of course, a lot of environmental. But almost every one of our institutions, financial institutions and foundations, has a strong environmental program, many of them landing in cities, because as you were saying, most of the time, the most environmentally sensitive or the most environmentally the places most at risk for climate change, for example, are where the poorest people live.
Mm-hmm.
Case in point, Katrina and New Orleans.
Right, right. There's some interest coming in the chat boxes about back to your racial inequity
Yeah.
program. And so one of the questions could just be a simple answer, but I know you said you were just 2 years into this, but people want to know, how do they find out more? Is there a
Yeah.
framework that you're working from? Is there documents that they can go get on your website, that kind of thing?
You should be able to go to our website and just type in racial equity here. living_cities.org. Oh no, livingcities.org is our website. Living_cities is our Twitter handle. But you can also go to the GARE, GARE.org. And they are the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. You should be able to easily find them. You can see all the cities across the U.S. that are participating with them in one way or another.
Okay, great, thanks. How do you kind of another measurement question? The question what metrics and collaborative tools are being
Sure.
used for for your work on racial equity? And you had add to that, you had mentioned, sometimes we need to look at progress not in terms of of hard data about change, but the level of community engagement and so on. What kind of metrics are you using around community engagement and to see the progress towards your work?
Yeah, so like I was saying, we don't dictate the metrics for the communities that are taking on this work. They all have different ones, and I believe if you go to our website, livingcities.org, put in the Integration Initiative, or TII, you should be able to find the metrics that each of the 5 cities that we're working with are using overall. I don't know, I don't remember if those dashboards go that, how deep they go, how many layers down they go, but you should be able to see the dashboards for each city on that. For ourselves, we actually hold ourselves, I mean, we're really saying we want to see, are we closing the gaps, the racial gaps in income and wealth? And so we've actually adopted a series of really headline outcomes. And then we say, are we contributing to that? To get to your point early on in our conversation, Mark,
Right.
we don't believe nor care about attribution, but we do believe we want to know if we're contributing to that. And one of the ways that we measure ourselves is, are the metrics that our communities have adopted, are they trending up? Are the majority of the metrics that they've chosen trending up year over year? And are they on course in the majority of those metrics to what they had set out to do? If so, we're part of building a new urban practice, because that's what we're trying to do. If not, why not? And what do we have to do to help them and others to change? But overall, we're measuring ourselves through an array of ways that way, to see, are we actually contributing to closing the racial gaps in income and wealth in U.S. cities.
Cool. To the audience, we still have time for questions. So if you've got any, please put them in the chat box. I have more myself, but I certainly would like to share yours if you have them. You know, earlier, Ben, you referred to the 25 disruptive leaders, and I know that they're leaders who are committed to working with racism, improving lives of low-income people. Can you just say a little bit more about that group, like some
Sure.
examples of who they are and what they're doing to in alignment with your work, so people
Sure.
get a sense of that group that's connected to you?
Yeah. So it's quite a diverse group of folks, and we wanted to, reflect that. We wanted that to reflect the sheer diversity of people that are willing to, be a disruptive leader and to change the course of opportunity in America, especially for people of color. But they range from the CEO of Audible, the Audible book company.
Mm-hmm.
Don Katz is the founder and CEO. He moved his company to Newark, New Jersey, a place that many companies were moving out of, not in. He helped to build an incubator there and a venture capital fund to invest in entrepreneurs of color coming out of Newark, something that people thought was impossible. He actually subsidizes some of his employees to actually live and work in Newark. It's someone from a Don Katz, all the way to someone who's really been a huge leader of this work, Angela Glover Blackwell at PolicyLink, who coined the phrase equity is the new growth model a number of years ago, and and many other people in between. The mayor of Austin, Texas, who is one of our cities under racial equity here. A woman who founded and has long run the nonprofit. I'm trying to blank on their name. Terrible. But people who've been making loans that others said would never be able to be made into communities and to people in communities of color, journalists, writers. I mean, really cuts across the gamut of people, kind of more traditional in a sense to much less traditional, who today are coming together and really shaping the future of our country.
Mm-hmm. One of the things too I'm interested in, and I also mentioned in the introduction, is I think it's called the Catalyst Fund, and
Yeah.
how we all know money is important and
Yes.
fuels change and also fuels the status quo. Actually, can you speak a little
Right.
bit about what are you doing with that fund? What difference has it made in some cities, for example? And
Yeah.
I think people would be interested in understanding a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so it's a great example, Mark, of what you had asked before about, like, why are these financial institutions and foundations still at our table? And our current fund, the Blended Catalyst Fund, it's called blended because it has commercial debt from our financial institutions, it has program-related investment from our foundations, and it has grant money at the bottom. And we're able to use that to, and they all invested in it, not because it was a fund and they're looking to invest in funds, but they wanted to innovate and learn together. That they said, we know we want to get our money back, but we want to take more risk with this fund. We want to do stuff that we're not already doing, and we want to make sure that we learn from it so we can either do more of it in our own house or just help others do more of it. But very, very different principles behind the fund at the very beginning. And so with that fund, which is only a year old, we've done some really, really interesting things. And all the investors in the fund get to approve whether we do or don't make the loans or investments. So they don't just give the money and then say, good luck. So just to give you a couple of examples, we have invested in more pay-for-success transactions in the U.S. than any other investor, not by volume of dollars, but in number of transactions, because we wanted to understand, how will these work? What are the barriers? Can it really get government to get better results for their money? Will it really bring in private capital and keep them in the deals? And so we've done that. With the money. We've also invested, we are really trying to, if you're going to address the racial income gaps, then you actually have to create many more jobs than we've been creating. And we need the people who are the growing part of our population, especially people of color, to be doing that, and women. And so we invested in a new venture capital run by these two young women entrepreneurs called the Urban Innovation Fund. You can find them online. And they were running an incubator called Tummel, and they said, we can't get these companies early stage money, we need to build our own fund. And so we were an early investor with a mid-year network, and then we've helped them bring in other investors. And so far in their couple of years of work, I think 60+% of their investors, of their entrepreneurs are women and entrepreneurs of color, which is about 60% more than the vast majority of venture capital in America, at least, which is, women and people of color are down at 1, 2, 3% of the people who get their money.
Right. Very cool. I'm going to go read more about that on your website then.
Yeah, it's a great investment, great bunch of people.
So I think we have time for one more question. So here's a lot of the, in my work with Vibrant Communities Canada, we work with a network of 55, 56 cities across the country, large and small, from major cities to small towns, who have local or who are leading local poverty reduction efforts. So usually under a collective impact model where there's business at the table and so forth. But none of these groups, in fact, many of the groups working on poverty are poor themselves. They're underfunded.
That's right.
And we know that one of the keys for success in poverty reduction is a collective impact approach that brings together governments and business. But not all of those communities are have a formal relationship with the municipality, or aren't receiving any support, aren't connected in any way, and they don't have the Rockefellers and the Fords on their board to help them do that.
No, we're blessed.
So do you have any insights or advice to groups that are really working on the ground like that, who really don't have the means that you do? And what would you be doing if you were sitting at their table, knowing how important it is to get with government? Well, what suggestions would you have about how to create some relationships?
Yeah, really hard, incredibly hard. And we work with 100+ cities in the US, but as you know, there's hundreds of cities, many much smaller than the ones we work in. And it's the smaller the city, sometimes easier to get work done, but usually much fewer resources, and the ability to stay at something for a long time is so much harder. So I totally appreciate that. I think there's a couple things to do, not that these are any silver bullets, Mark. But one of them is, one of my favorite phrases that most people who know me are sick of, is that we have to continue to say that process is the new program. That we actually don't need more programs, the shiny new penny that allows us to train 5 phlebotomists when we actually need 5,000 jobs. We actually need to change the systems, and the systems are about process. And someone has to get up every day, these organizations that you are referring to, or someone's just like it, and we have to support them over the long term to keep the people together. You know, Mark, from doing this work, nobody wants to pay to help people collaborate. When people don't have the help, they go back to the way they always do their own work. It's not that they're not working now, they're just not working and getting the results we want. And so we've learned over the years that somebody has to get up every morning, and their job has to be to keep those people glued together. And more importantly, to make sure that they have to hold themselves accountable. And that has to be paid for, and that's process. And you know that over the years, people and philanthropists love to pay for program, but they really need to learn how to pay for process. And it needs to flip. They need to go 85% process, 15% program, or something like that, not the other way around. That's one. The other is that they need to, and again, it sounds easier said than done, but they need to find champions within those philanthropic or private sector industries or sectors who will take this on. They will lead by example, and they will get their colleagues to do the same. They don't have to change 100%. They just have to start doing much more of it. Because my guess is, if your communities are anything like ours, they're right now doing almost none. And so if they go from 0 to 10%, go from 10 to 20, from 20 to 30, you will see a lot more progress, especially if they get champions, they and the other champions agree that these are the results we're trying to see happen in our community. Let me leave you with this, Mark, and people can go look at this too. Our friends at the Boston Fed were trying to understand, why did some U.S. cities turn themselves around and others didn't? And so they went and they talked to 25 cities, basically east of the Mississippi, old industrial cities, and they ran the numbers. And they said, our economists are going to figure this out. We're going to find the quantitative reasons, the patterns. They found nothing. So they said, well, maybe we should go talk to the people. And they went and they talked to the leaders in all these cities. And what they found was the cities that turned themselves around had multiple leaders from multiple sectors who basically said, the only way this is going to turn around if we lead. And they led from wherever they sat, whether it was a university or a nonprofit or a YMCA or a company, and they said, if we all agree that we need to turn this around, we're going to turn it around. And that was the only common thread among all those communities, and that's what has to happen.
Good advice, Ben. Thanks for that. I know you don't have silver bullets, but it's certainly it's a catalyst for thinking. Ben, thanks so much for being here. You and I have done this before. I don't know, a year and a half ago or so.
Yep.
And so it's always a pleasure to speak with you and work with you and your team too, because I've been working with them.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you at the CCI in September, and we'll be doing some work there together as well.
Good. I look forward to seeing you in Vancouver.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Megan, I'll turn it over to you now to bring things to a close.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mark and Ben. This has been an engaging and dynamic conversation. And thanks so much for everybody out there who's joined us and for your comments and questions throughout. As promised, in a few days, we will email you with links to the audio and other material related to today's call. We do welcome your feedback on these calls, so if you have any for us, email us at tamarack@tamarackcommunity.ca to let us know how we're doing. I also want to remind you about what I mentioned at the beginning of the call, a very exciting learning opportunity coming your way. The Community Change Institute is our signature event here at Tamarack, and will be taking place in Vancouver, BC this fall from September 25th to 29th. The year's theme is Cities of the Future, Co-Creating Tomorrow, and will feature a stacked cast of keynote and workshop speakers, including the wonderful Ben Hecht, fascinating city walkabouts, a co-creation lab, and many opportunities to dive deep into the content with your peers from across the globe and apply what you're learning to the local context and projects in which you're working. To learn more and register, follow the link on your screen. I'll also be sure to include that in our post-webinar email to you. And we are closing our hold a seat option this week, so if it's something you're interested in attending and are just waiting for some approval, do hold your seat before the end of the week so you don't miss out. To learn about all of our upcoming events and webinars like this one, as well as to discover the latest resources, articles, tools, and thinking on community change, visit our website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca, and sign up for our monthly e-magazine, Engage. Also, visit www.livingcities.org to learn more about Living Cities and the work that Ben is working and leading across America. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you.